Unit 3, Lesson 3, The Age of Imperialism. Unit 3, Lesson 3, Vocabulary. Looking back to the late 1700s and through late 1800s, Europeans were preoccupied with happenings on the European continent and in the existing European colonies. We're talking about the American Revolution and the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, the Latin American Wars for Independence, the growth of nationalism within each European country, and the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution especially helped speed up colonialism. We have the Age of Exploration, where Europeans raced for overseas colonies, and the growth of European commerce and trade worldwide led to a commercial revolution worldwide. So let's begin the Age of Imperialism by exploring the Age of Exploration, which lasted approximately from 1850 to 1914. The Age of Exploration was a time of discovery of new lands, innovations in cartography, which is map making, and trade, and the exchange of cultures and ideas from these distant lands with the European powers. Were the reasons for exploration, you ask? Well, Europeans wanted glory for themselves and their nations. That's nationalism. And they needed new markets for raw materials and trade. The Industrial Revolution caused the need for resources to fuel industrial production in Europe and in the United States. But where would these resources come from? Well, mainly they came from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. These are the different forms of imperialism found throughout this period, along with the characteristics of each. The different forms of imperialism encompass colonies, protectorates, spheres of influence, or economic imperialism. Within those forms of imperialism, we have two distinct types of management: indirect control and direct control. Causes of imperialism can be boiled down to three M's: might, money, and morals. The might reasons were mainly military or political reasons. Because they were more technologically advanced, many Europeans and Americans felt that they had the right to dominate the peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The money reasons talk about the economic competition between European nations needing new markets to sell their goods. And the moral reasons have to do mainly with religious and social reasons, whereas Europeans and Americans felt the need to Christianitize the people of Asia and Africa, like the need to civilize and westernize others. Looking specifically at those might motives, the military motives especially, the imperialist nations like Great Britain and France, they wanted to establish military bases abroad in these imperial territories. The British naval bases began to pop up in cities like Aden and Alexandria, Cyprus, Hong Kong, and Singapore. The imperialist nations also wanted to add manpower, that is, adding soldiers to protect the interests of their nation. The British added the Indian sepoys. These were citizens and soldiers of the country of India fighting for the British protectorate. And the French, they added the North African troops of the North African countries like Morocco. Another reason that the imperialist nations wanted to expand their military power was they needed to come up with an overwhelming number of soldiers and troops that were needed to combat the ambush and sabotage from insurgents or rebels in these foreign nations. That was a process known as guerrilla warfare, where citizens and soldiers alike would align themselves against the imperialist powers, trying to fight them back through these guerrilla warfare tactics and strategies. Another might motive is the political motives, the sense of nationalism, of national pride, where the British people felt that the sun would never set on the British Empire because they colonized and took over so many foreign territories around the globe. that these large empires would increase the national pride for the native citizens of Great Britain, of France, of Germany, of Italy. And so you have this process where the European powers are competing to build the largest empire that was fueled by the thought of social Darwinism. Where social Darwinism, they interpreted Charles Darwin's evolutionary theory in terms of powerful nations, where only the strong survived, only the fittest survived. So, translating that from the animal kingdom to the political realm, only the strongest nations survived. Powerful nations are able to develop areas and resources being wasted by native peoples. Now we can begin to look at the money or the economic motives. So these other nations, these imperialized nations, these conquered nations, provided markets for finished goods. Products of British Industrial Revolution were sold in China and India just as evidence. They also became major sources for raw materials. Egypt had the cotton trade, Malaysia had rubber and tin, and the Middle East had copious or large amounts of oil. These impoverished nations, which were now under European control, also provided the capital for investments, whereas the profits from Industrial Revolution were invested in mines and railroads in these unindustrialized areas to help build up the infrastructure to further facilitate trade. If we start looking at the moral motives, specifically the religious motives, this was all about a conversion to Christianity and an end of the century crusading spirit where missionaries were sent to Africa, to Asia, to Hawaii to try to convert the pagan people, convert the non Christians into Christianity. This political cartoon, okay, or image, represents Kipling's White Man's Burden, with the Uncle Sam of the United States and Great Britain carrying indigenous peoples and native peoples caricatures, more like it, past barbarism and oppression, past superstition and vices, up the mountain towards civilization. And the other moral motives being the social motives, I refer you back to the White Man's Burden, the Kipling poem that we read dated from 1899, how they felt that the European culture was superior to all other cultures, and that white individuals were morally obligated to bring the blessings of civilization to backward, uncivilized people. So what helped enable imperialism? Well, we've talked about how Europeans' technological superiority helped them gain advantages, especially militarily. This included the Maxim or machine gun, the improvements in transportation from the steamship that helped the European powers get to Asian and African colonies. And once they were on those colonies, the Bessemer process and the cheap and affordable steel helped them build railroads and create infrastructure within those countries. Social advances, like the advances in medicine, such as quinine, which protected Europeans from foreign diseases like malaria, and also disunity among ethnic groups in Africa, with civil wars and infighting a common occurrence. This allowed the European imperialistic powers to overtake these countries with relative ease. This map gives you an overview of the colonial empires in the world in 1914. So, what did imperialism look like in Asia? Between the First Opium War, which was a battle between Britain against China, and the Second Opium War, which was a battle between France and Britain against China. Each war, France and Britain were victorious and gained commercial privileges in China. This led to an increase in European spheres of influence within China, where British forces were allowed control of Hong Kong, both economically and politically, for 99 years. And this just ended recently, 25 years ago, in 1997. British India. Well, India was considered Britain's jewel in the crown for its importance in the international trade markets and raw materials and its people. The time period of British rule in India was known as British Raj, and there was an unsuccessful rebellion against British rule in India by the Indian soldiers. This is called the Sepoy Rebellion, and it happened in 1857. Suez Canal became one of the landmark infrastructure projects throughout the imperialistic era in both Asia and Africa, actually. The Suez Canal is one of the world's most important waterways, providing the shortest sea link between Europe and Asia through, like the Africa through Middle East. Even today, 12% of global trade happens through the Suez Canal, and 30% of global container traffic every day passes through the Suez Canal. Concerning imperialism in Africa, beginning with the Berlin Conference, which happened in 1884 and 1885, this is where European nations met to lay down rules for dividing independent African nations. And at the Berlin Conference, it was decided that any European nation could claim land in Africa by telling the others and showing they could control the area, showing they could have a police force there. Europeans paid no attention to the ethnic and linguistic divisions within Africa when dividing it amongst themselves. Furthermore, no African leaders attended this meeting. The impact of imperialism in Africa. There were some positives to go along with the numerous negatives. On the positive side, local warfare when civil wars was reduced, and they helped improve sanitation and the infrastructure. Building of hospitals and roadways led to increased lifespan for the citizens. Buildings of schools led to increased literacy, which helped spur economic growth. But the negatives, the independent sovereign African nations lost their land and their independence. Men were forced to work in European owned mines and on European owned farms. There was massive contempt for traditional culture and admiration of European culture. This created like identity problems amongst the people. And with the dividing up of Africa, artificial boundaries were divided, or artificial boundaries were created, which divided kinship groups and united rivals. See, the European imperialist nations had no understanding or care of how Africa was divided up locally and regionally. They came in and arbitrarily drew their demarcation lines, their separating lines on the map for which country, which European country wanted to take over this part of Africa. There were two major sovereign nations that we'll talk about and we'll focus on in Africa. The first is Ethiopia. This was an African country that was actually able to fight off their imperial power. They were able to fight off Italy and remain an independent sovereign nation throughout this whole scramble for Africa, throughout the scramble for land by European imperialistic powers. In Liberia, this was an African country founded in 1847 from freed American slaves, both those who were born free and those who were recently emancipated by the Emancipation Proclamation from Abraham Lincoln. They were helped and funded and organized by the American Colonization Society, which sought to establish free sovereign nations for the former slaves. Some of the European empires of Spain and Portugal and the Netherlands, and some of the European empires of Britain and France.